With the upcoming movie, CODA, coming out here this week, I thought it may be interesting to kind of share some of my experience. I'm a CODA, C-O-D-A, a child of deaf adults. You know, from the time I can remember, from a very little child up through grade school, as a teenager, heck, even as an adult, I've always been asked so many times I can't even recall this one question. Hey, but you know, that's not true. It almost always is with kind of a quiet voice, kind of a somber face. Hey, what was it like having deaf parents? And I, either as a child or as a teenager or even as an adult, would somehow, perhaps flippantly, maybe a little sarcastically respond, you know what, I don't know, I never had hearing parents. You know, I'm sure it was a defensive mechanism perhaps, just to shut the conversation down. But I want to make it really clear. My parents' deafness was an incredible blessing in my life. And it's going to be impossible for me to capture the richness, all of the experiences, the ups, the downs, the highs, the lows of growing up as a child of deaf adults. But I thought I would share a little bit. Now, please remember, this is my story. This is my thing, right? Every CODA, in fact, all of us have different experiences growing up. So this is just my life as a CODA. Plus, remember, I'm a product of my time. I grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Being deaf back then was different. I won't say easier, but it was different. Accessibility, acceptance, ASL, deafness, American Sign Language as a language in the schools wasn't there yet. It was a different experience. So anyway, I thought I would share a little bit of experience of what it was like to grow up as a child of deaf adults. Perhaps the best way to do that would be with some stories. So let me share a few stories that are some of my favorites in illustrating what it was like to have deaf parents. Here's one of my favorite. We lived in a fairly smaller town, not with a lot of deaf friends. Most of my parents' friends lived on the West Coast, California specifically. And so when they would get together again, I don't know how to describe it, but you've got to understand, my parents lived a really isolated life. They didn't have a lot of deaf friends. Much of their life was just putting food on the table. My dad worked 2 to 3 jobs. My mom had full-time employment. We were in school. And so there's just so much to do, just keeping food on the table, just growing up, just surviving. So when friends would come, deaf friends, all right, they haven't seen in a long time, wow, the hands would go, the signing would go. And one of the things I miss, I didn't think I was going to say this, one of the things I miss is the physical embrace. Even as a child, I remember hugging and embracing deaf friends and uncles and aunts, and just knowing that they loved me. It was a great blessing in my life. Anyway, they would come over, and my siblings and I would be sent off to bed while the adults talked and talked and talked and talked. In fact, the sign is like this. And that means to go on and on and on and on. It can be done both positively and negatively. Look at the face, right? If it's a good experience, wow, that story can be a negative experience, like somebody went on and on and on and on. Anyway, we'll talk about sign language later. Anyway, so they would tell stories and catch up on the news and the gossip and work and employment and kids. We would sneak out of our rooms. We would crawl very carefully down the floor, and we'd look around the corner. And I can remember to this day the joy that my parents felt, that their friends felt, in just talking to somebody who understood all of the craziness, all of the aspects, all the challenges, the frustrations, and the successes of life. And I would watch those hands and see those stories and stay up as long as I could. This was when I was younger. Stay up as long as I could until my eyes drooped shut. I'd fall asleep right there on the floor of the hallway, and hours later, my parents would get up. Oh, there he is again. And lovingly and tenderly scoop me up and put me back in bed. They never yelled at me or got mad at me for getting out of bed. But that experience was one of those things that just cemented my appreciation, my admiration, my love for being with the deaf. See, as a CODA, I'm kind of in between two worlds. Sure, I'm hearing, no question about that, obviously, right? But there's a part of me that is deaf, a part of me that I miss. Sometimes when I want to talk to myself, I'll sign. Sometimes when I pray, I'll pray and sign. So being a CODA is a little strange, trying to hop between two worlds and sometimes getting lost in the middle. Story number 2. Oftentimes, again, back in my time, right, we didn't have the great video phones and accessibility that we have today. And so I would be called on. I was the oldest child. Now, don't misunderstand me. CODAs of all ages, oldest, youngest, in between, boys, girls, it just kind of depends. Both of my siblings sign. They all have done tons of interpreting, so I just had the first shot at it. So interpreting for mom and dad took different roles. Sometimes it was on the phone. I would have to deal with a phone call between my dad's boss and my dad. If you can imagine 6, 7, 8, 10, 15-year-old kid trying to navigate the nuances, the challenges, the negative comments, the positive comments, back and forth between my mom or my dad and their employer. It was tough. I won't try and whitewash it. It was difficult. It was a challenge in trying to represent my dad. And I know some people will say that wasn't my role. I get that. But it was for me. And at that time, in deafness, where I grew up, with who I grew up, I represented my dad to his employer despite my youth. And sometimes that could be a challenge. There were other challenges as well. Sometimes the school would call. And so, yes, true confessions. Did I occasionally take advantage of my parents' deafness? Yeah. The school would call, and you would know that they would call, or else I would call them. Sometimes I would have to change my voice and be the adult. Excuse me, this is Mr. So-and-so. My son will not be in today. So I can imagine that. Parent-teacher conferences, secretary in attendance, again, the same thing. I acted as an intermediary between my parents and the world, trying to navigate some things which even for me were strange, trying to understand what to say and how to say and vocal tones and intonations and everything else. How about another story? One of the things that my dad was super sensitive about was I proud or was I embarrassed to be a CODA? Now, we didn't know CODAs back then. The child of deaf adult label came much, much later. So if I was on a date, if I had friends over, if I was in a club, my dad would inevitably sign. Does that person or that club know that your mom and dad are deaf? See the eyebrows as they go up in a question? Know they're deaf? And I'd say, yes, they know you're deaf. Because I was. Sure, there were times when it was hard. There were times when I didn't want to be the representative or the intermediary anymore. But I will say that overall, it was a great thing. And let me say that for a minute. We had a really strange relationship. It was parent and child, no question. But it was also peer. It was also friend. It was also interpreter. It was also voice. There were things like, for example, if we had to go buy a new car, my dad would bring me in tow, and I was the voice. As we negotiated the price on that new car. Now, occasionally I'll laugh and say, did we use that to our advantage? Did my father use that to his advantage when we negotiated with an unwitting, unknowing, and obviously awkward salesperson trying to get the best price he could for the car, talking to a young kid who verbalized while this older gentleman signed, and sometimes signed pretty dramatically. Anyway, lots of experiences like that, a lot of adult experiences. my children have recognized that perhaps I always grew up kind of old, right? I was always kind of an adult because of those experiences. It was a blessing. It was a blessing in my life. Now, was it always easy and simple? No. Perhaps a tender experience. When my grandfather passed away, and let me say this, if you go back the prior generation, it was even more difficult to be deaf. Sign language was not accepted. In fact, there were times when my parents were physically restrained or punished for signing. At that time, in our environment, in that situation, trying to be able to verbalize was the epitome. And so my parents had to dig into it again and again and again and again. And not all deaf people are the same. My mother has a greater ability to communicate. My father never did. My father almost never used his voice. And so if you go back, my grandfather never learned how to sign. Not once. Not a single sign. And before you're too hard, that wasn't that unusual back then. Anyway, so my grandfather passed away, and we went back to the funeral. The pastor brought us in and allowed us to have a quiet moment in the chapel with my grandfather, who was in the coffin at the time. It was just us, just my dad, just me, my mom, and my siblings. And as we came up to the coffin, I respectfully stood back. And my dad, signing to no one in particular, not to me, just to himself, really, just kind of signing out loud, said a sentence that I'll never forget. I wish you had learned how to sign. Hit me like a ton of bricks. He had never had that kind of communication with his father. His father never learned to sign. And in fact, in later years, after I came along and my siblings, if my grandfather wanted to talk to his son, he did it through us. CODAs, Child of Deaf Adults. Those were hard things. Hard things. But I will tell you that overall, this wonderful, crazy experience has blessed my life. In fact, I've told people that every success I've had has come from my growing up with a mom and dad who are deaf. So, when I'm asked by somebody who cares, and somebody I care about, what was it like to have deaf parents? I tell them the truth. It was wonderful. A blessing I am grateful for who I have become and the friendship that I developed with my parents. So the next time you see deaf parents, it's a good thing. And it's a blessing to their kids. Thanks, and I hope you learn lots on how to sign here on this channel.